Black, proud, independent, determined, educated, resilient, compassionate, batty, funny, quirky, unique, creative, thoughtful, sincere, loyal, gutsy, vibrant, resourceful, imaginative, engaging, fabulous, awesome. Those are all words that describe me, the Brick City Brown Chick. Welcome to my podcast, What I Know Now. Thanks for listening. Hello, and welcome back to What I Know Now. I am your host, the Brick City Brown Chick, and this is episode 10, Colorism. In the last episode, Here I Am, I talked about my own journey with my hair and talked about the importance of hair to all women and that it's a myth that hair is just important for Black women. Today, I'm going to talk about an issue that affects the Black community all over the world, not just in the United States, but it's a more pointed discussion here, and that is colorism. Now, if you're asking what colorism means, it's essentially discriminating against people who are dark skinned. And it refers to mostly incidences that go on within a race. So colorism is different from racism in that racism is people from other groups discriminating against a group of people, while colorism is how people within a certain group view each other. Now, the first thing I have to confess is colorism and discussions of color and skin tone were never a topic of conversation in my family. And I've said this to Black people before, and they've always looked at me skeptically like, really? Nobody in your family had issues with X or Y or this person or that person or made comments? That was really not a discussion in my family. I'm not sure why it wasn't. I know so many Black people who've said, oh, yeah, it was always an issue for us. But that was never an issue in my family. I am my father's complexion. My father may have even been a couple of shades lighter than me, but my mother is very dark skinned. But nobody ever said, is that your child or that sort of thing. I first experienced colorism on a personal level when I went to college. When I went to college, especially as a freshman and a sophomore, people who were new to me and I was new too, they would come to my room and see the pictures I had up. And I had pictures of my parents and pictures of them with me and pictures of them just by themselves. And somehow or other, lots of people, mostly white people, honestly, did not make the connection that these two people were my parents for some reason. They would look at pictures of my mother and then look at me and say, was your father white? And I would just look at them totally mystified, to be honest, and then would point to pictures on my wall like, those are my parents. And they would say, oh, well, you're so much lighter than your mother is. Like, yes, I'm my father's complexion or somewhere in between. That's how biology works. It was just very confusing to me that it was such a confusing concept for them. And so that was the first time I was really sort of hit with how colorism affects people and how people see that situation. The next time was also in college. I was probably a senior, I guess, and a friend of mine had graduated the year before me. And she also lived where I lived, so I would go to visit her periodically. And she was dating a guy I knew from college. She was lighter than me, and he was close to my mother's complexion. He was much darker than me. And her mother said, "He's a nice guy. I like him, but you can't marry him because it's taken us so many generations to get this light. And if you marry him, you're going to ruin that and we'll be back to square zero." And I was just blown away with how blunt her mother was about her feelings. And my friend just sort of shrugged it off. But eventually she did break up with him, and some years later married a completely different guy who I didn't know, who I'm sure she loved, but was much closer to her mother's expectation. And so I think a lot of people who are not familiar with colorism think, oh, it's just, people teasing each other. It's just somebody saying, oh, you're not as light as your sister, or oh, you look so different from your sister because she's so much darker than you. But it is something that really affects people's psyche, I've observed over the long term. One of the clear memories I have from being a kid is our neighbors across the street were a longtime married couple, and the wife was extremely light skinned. And for people of a certain age who know what this term means, is she is a woman who could pass. And for people who don't know what that means someone who is so light skinned they could pass for white. If you didn't know, you would assume they were white. I never assumed as a child that she was white. I always thought she was black. I just thought she was very, very light skinned. I understood that there were people of different skin tones within the black community. My mother and I are a prime example of that. So I was never confused as a child, but I do know that some people did confuse her and thought, why does she live in this all black neighborhood as a white woman? Because she was not a white woman. She was a woman of color. She was just very light skinned. They had three daughters. The oldest daughter, P, is dark skinned. She has her father's complexion. The two other daughters, D and B, are not quite as light as their mother, but they're very, very light skinned. And I did notice that people sort of took a different stance with P, the oldest daughter. And it wasn't until years later that I understood why people treated P so differently than they treated D and B. And it was because P was her father's complexion, she was dark skinned. And so there was just an immediate different reaction. Now, the logical question here is, why is colorism still a thing? And to understand that, we have to go back to the origins of colorism, at least here in the United States. It goes back to slavery. And I can sort of feel people going, oh no, not something else that talks about slavery. But this is where it comes from, and it's important. When slaves were brought from Africa to the United States, over time, as they were forced into relationships with their captors, i.e., white men, they had children who were much lighter than they were. So as slavery got more and more distant from the African continent, from where people originally were taken from, their children became lighter skinned because of the mixing with white people and also the mixing with Native Americans. Most Black people are convinced that they have ancestry that is Native American. A lot of us do, and a lot of us don't. It's sort of a family myth conversation that gets passed down from people. Now, today we have the advantage of DNA tests. So people can actually find out factually whether their great great grandmother really was Cherokee or whether that was just a story that was passed down through the family. So the basis of colorism through slavery became that as generations of slaves became lighter and lighter, the lighter skinned slaves, because they looked closer to white, were allowed to work in the house. So they were maids, they were personal assistants to the ladies of the house, that sort of thing. Whereas the darker skinned slaves worked outside in the fields, in the heat, in the sun. And so that was the initial real separation within the Black community from each other, because this group of people were treated differently and treated better because they were light skinned versus the people who were dark skinned who were treated worse and got the worst jobs. So that's the origin of colorism in the United States. Over time, with the end of slavery, that gulf that had been opened never fully healed for a lot of Black parents. They feel just like my friend's mother did, that they have come to a certain place in the world and in life, and they feel like their complexion is so important that they don't want to go backwards. They see being lighter as a step forward because it makes them closer to the European ideal. Yes, this is very nuanced and very complicated. It's not a simple conversation. It's not something people just easily understand. But the important point is that over time, it is something that's just been ingrained in Black people. And for some families, it's a big deal. It's a big conversation. What I'm not sure that the people of the older generation who talk about these things understand is how it affects their children, especially their daughters. When a girl is told that she is beautiful and she has, this is a whole different conversation, but most people will know what I mean when I say good hair. She has hair that's closer to the European ideal. That is her currency. Because she looks that way, she will get noticed by a different caliber of man. She will be noticed and appreciated by men who are professional, who are going to college, who are lawyers and doctors, and that should be her expectation. and that should be what she strives for. Now, right about now, you're probably saying to me, if you're not Black, whoa, this is a whole lot of information, and this is so much more complicated than I thought it was. And it really is. And I don't think most families are being malicious when they talk about this. I don't think my friend's mother thought she was being mean or malicious. She was just expressing her opinion. But of course, her opinion affected her daughter's choice. I don't know that if her mother hadn't have told her how she felt, that my friend would have broken up with her boyfriend. I don't know if that was a thing between them or if her mother's words really did have an influence on what was ultimately her union. And what I wanted to say to Black women of all shades is it's important that you understand the backstory and where this came from, how it came out of slavery. And it's not just something that happens just in your family or just in your friend group. It really does happen everywhere to most of us. I consider myself super lucky that I grew up in a family of women of all complexions, of all sizes, and that was never a discussion. Nobody ever said to me, oh, you're so much prettier than your mom because you're so much lighter than she is, or like, oh, you're really lucky that you look like your dad and not like your mom. No one ever said that to me, not as a child, not as a teenager, not as an adult. Because it was never a conversation, it was never a thought to me or for me. So when I got older, when I got to college, and when I got out into the world and started to understand how other people felt about colorism, it really did make me take a step back and re-examine some of the experiences I had outside my house with people who were friends and not family. One of the examples I remember from high school is I talked a couple of episodes ago about my friend Jay and how we looked absolutely nothing alike except for the fact that we were both Black, because she was tall and thin and had beautiful long hair, but she was dark skinned. And I remember one day somebody calling for me in the hallway, and I turned around and they looked at me and laughed and then said, "Oh, I'm sorry. I was looking for Jay. I don't know how I confused you because she's so much darker than you." And I just thought, what a weird, terrible thing to say. But then I thought about it later and thought, okay, why do I think someone identifying someone as dark is terrible? Because that is what Black people and Americans in general are conditioned to believe. We are conditioned to believe that women of color who are closer to white, closer to the European ideal, are more valuable and should be more valued. And that is something that we as a culture, and by culture in this case, I mean American culture, really need to work on if we are ever going to get to the point of being what people like to call a colorblind society. Now, if you're asking me as a 53-year-old Gen X woman, do I believe that America will ever be colorblind? Absolutely not. And if you want to know why I don't believe that, just look at our current condition and how much America has regressed just in the last decade. People now feel like it's okay to wear their racism, colorism, everything, misogyny on their sleeve like it's a badge of honor. No one is embarrassed anymore about being racist, about calling people names, any of that. So, for the progress that this country has made, and I'm not saying we haven't made any progress, my personal feeling is we've made a lot less progress than people think we have, and I'm not sure it's not going to get worse. I'm not sure this country wants to get better. And I say that because whenever conversations like this come up, the general consensus is people roll their eyes or sigh or throw up their hands and say, why are we still talking about this? And the fact that that's the response instead of, okay, I know I've heard this before, but let me hear it from you because you may have a different perspective. That's not the reaction people have. People have the reaction instead of, I don't want to hear this. I don't want to go through this again. Why is this still a thing? Now, within the Black community, there have been documentaries, specials, conversations between women of various colors about how they were affected by colorism through their childhood. And I've watched a lot of them because I really wanted to get an understanding, a firsthand understanding from people about how they felt, since it was not a conversation in my family. And the hurt and the pain of the women who were darker skinned, even though whatever happened to them might have been 15, 20, 30, 40 years ago, is still palpable. It is something they still carry years onward. And that's the part of this that makes me really sad and makes me feel that we, meaning Black people, need to do better by our sisters. That we need to be conscious of the things we say to little kids, especially. Little kids hold on to pain in a way that I'm not sure adults really understand. And I'll give an example. When I was a kid, probably like 6 or 7, my uncle, my father's brother, who lived across the street from us, saw me outside during the summer in a pair of shorts. Like all little kids run around in shorts. This is one of those things. And he decided to give me a nickname at that point, which now I can laugh about. But at the time, when I was 6, it didn't bother me. But as I got to be 12 and 13 and 14, a preteen and a teenage girl, it bothered the hell out of me. He decided to nickname me Big Legs because he said in shorts, like I had big thighs. So he always called me Big Legs. And what I mean by that is if he saw me leaving the house, coming home, wherever he saw me, he would just wave and be like, "Hey, Big Legs, how you doing?" Literally did not call me by my name at all, just referred to me as Big Legs. Okay, again, as a little girl, I really didn't get it. I really didn't understand it, didn't pay it a lot of attention. Figured it was just him. Gave all his nieces and nephews nicknames. But right around 11, 12, it really did start to irk me that's what he called me. Now, because I grew up in the generation I did, with the Southern family that I did, there was no way I was going to go marching across the street and say, "You shouldn't call me that. That's rude. What is wrong with you?" Blah, 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 blah. That was not an option. It wasn't going to happen. So I just sort of swallowed it and dealt with it. And then the year I turned 18, which was I turned 18 about 5 months after my father died. He saw me outside and walked up to me and said, "Well, you're 18. You're a woman now, so I guess I should start calling you by your name." And he called me by my birth name for the rest of his life. And it was just one of those really strange things. But even as a grown woman, I clearly remember how much him calling me big legs irked my soul. It just did. And so I use that example just to say children hold on to things in a way that they don't understand at the time, will stay with them for a long time, maybe for the rest of their life, but that they do. And so we have to be much more conscious of what we say to children, especially to our daughters. We have to be conscious of saying, "Why can't you be more like your sister?" Or "Your sister's so pretty," or "Your sister puts on makeup better than you do," or fill in the blank. Because girls especially hold on to those things, and they will hear them play in their head years later, even when they're in situations that have nothing to do with what happened. Things just sort of come back sometimes. Do not know why my headphones are not agreeing with me today, but they're not. But we'll keep going. So, again, colorism is destructive within the Black community. That's one of the big things. It separates us from each other, whether it's men or women. This is something that women talk about much more than men. I don't know that I've ever seen a special on colorism that just talks to men. It's always women. And I think that's because women just take that into heart in a different way. So what I know now that I didn't know as a young girl is that I likely am sometimes treated better in my life than a woman who looks just like me, except she's much darker than I am. And that gets into a conversation about privilege, which is another one of those buzzwords that just makes people lose their mind. But do I have a privilege that a woman darker skinned than I am doesn't have? I'm sure I do. Just the fact of the situation, I'm sure I do. Does that mean it's something I've ever been conscious of? Absolutely not. If I was in a situation where someone wanted to call out that someone was darker than me or thought I was prettier than someone who was darker than me, is that now a situation I would confront? Yes, I would, because now I'm a grown woman and I understand the privilege, which is something I did not understand at 10 or 20 or even necessarily 30. By 30, I had a better understanding of what it was, what colorism was, and what it did to people. But as I've gotten older, I've become much more conscious. I think something else I know now that I didn't know when I was young is that colorism has expanded with the increase in interracial marriage. So when interracial couples are now having children, they're now faced with not only people asking them if their child is black or white or Asian or white or Hispanic or fill in the blank. But if part of that couple is black, they're also dealing with, okay, well, did you marry this person outside your race because you wanted a child who was lighter? People ask all sorts of interesting questions and also make all sorts of assumptions about interracial couples who start families. So that's another thing we really need to consider is I live by the philosophy that people are good and their motives are honest unless they show me otherwise. If you show me that you have ill intent, okay, I understand you have ill intent, but I work from the philosophy of people are good and fair and honest until they show you differently. So I think we really do need to get to a place where we know that, or at least enter into the conversation that these two people got married because they love each other and they started a family because they wanted a family. And adding layers of confusion really doesn't help. Now, you may want an honest answer to a question about whether somebody married someone for this reason or this reason, or did they have children with this person because they wanted their children to be lighter, because they think they'd be more beautiful. It's a conversation that is important to have, but it's also important to be careful how you phrase it. So, especially if there are children around, so you aren't doing long-term damage to the children, which is ultimately what's important. So that is what I know now for today. I want to thank everybody for joining me, whether you're new or whether you're an OG. You've been here since episode 1. You can get episodes of this podcast anywhere you get your podcast. If you type in What I Know Now, there are 3 or 4 podcasts, interestingly enough, with this name. But I'm the only woman of color, and I've got a great big afro. It's a cartoon of me. So trust me, you'll know it's supposed to be me. And you can also join my YouTube page. If you type in Brick City Brown Chick, my YouTube page will come up, and all episodes of this podcast are available on my YouTube page. So thank everybody for joining me this week, and I will see you again. Bye-bye.